Our webinar is already recording, so while everyone is coming in, I will just say a warm good afternoon to everyone. My name is Marianne. I'm a clinical eye care research fellow at the University of Melbourne. I'm one of the facilitators of this webinar today. I would like to formally welcome everyone to this session on consent and ethics in dementia research. Now, before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the land on which we are all broadcasting from, and the land on which our attendees are joining from, in order to pay respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge that this land was never ceded. It always was, and always will be, Aboriginal land. This webinar has been organised by the ADNet Early to Mid-Career Researcher Accelerator Group, which aims to support and advocate for early and mid-career Australian dementia researchers and help develop future research leaders. The aim of today's webinar is to demystify steps involved in the ethics application process for conducting research projects involving people living with dementia as participants. While we allow some time for attendees to join us, I'll just go through some basic housekeeping notes. So if you have any questions for our presenters throughout the presentation, please type into the Q&A function. To maximise your Zoom meeting experience, all participants have been muted. In addition to this session will be recorded and made available on the ADNet EMCR webpage. Please ensure that you turn off your camera and microphone if you do not wish to appear in the recording. At the bottom of this page, there is also a link to the EMCR Accelerator Group website, which is where you can find the recording. So that's our housekeeping notes. I'm joined today by my co-facilitators, Dr. Jackie Wesson and Dr. Mona Sawan of the University of Sydney, and Dr. Diana Matovic of Macquarie University. I am joined today, our webinar is really fortunate to feature 5 speakers today. We have Chris Rosemayer, Margaret McAndrew, Natalie Ive, and myself, and Yun-Hee Jeon. We will hear from each of the speakers and then open up the floor for questions and answers. Please type any questions you might have into that Q&A panel as mentioned in the housekeeping notes. So I would now like to introduce our first speaker. So our first speaker is Mr. Chris Rosemayer. Chris is a senior manager within the Research Ethics and Integrity Office at the University of Queensland. Chris has seen a huge variety of research projects through the ethics approvals process. Chris is going to share some experiences on the topic of ethics applications for research involving people living with dementia and some top tips to help you produce a high quality application. Over to you, Chris. Take it away.
Thanks, Marianne. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to provide a perspective for submitting applications to ethics committees. I'm guessing many of you have done this many times, and all I'm here to do is help maybe share a few tips which can be helpful, but also maybe de-escalate some of the myths that are around dementia and ethics applications. Let's focus ourselves on the national statement, which of course is really important in terms of all our ethics applications. And dementia care is certainly an area which is increasing given the longevity of human beings in Australia and also the prevalence of dementia. Just as a reminder, the 4 principles of the national statement: merit and integrity, justice, beneficence, and respect. Now, when we look at the application, those principles come through in all aspects of the application. So from the very start, if all of you are familiar with the HREA or the relevant in-house university application processes, the first question really is much about who are the researchers and what is their contribution to the research and what are the skill sets they provide. So that part of the application is done really well. Everyone is pretty good at outlining their CV and their background, but what is not done so well is the purpose of the research and the question of the merit. Sometimes researchers are very good at knowing what they want to do, but they haven't actually convinced the committees as to what the need is. And I see more applications now involving consumers. Obviously in the space required for medical research or health research, and there's a bigger need to involve consumers. Not seeing terribly much, but it's becoming more prevalent. And again, I recommend that one of the discussion points would be how do you involve consumers in the health research? Through that development of partnerships, then of course the merit becomes really important, because you're actually dealing with the real concerns of consumers. When also looking at partnerships, and this is a problem for all research where you're using carers, what's the involvement of carers and how they're going to be participate, especially if the research is over a long period of time. If carers change and the communication channels change, how does that research continue? And so part of the merit and integrity aspect of the national statement is, can this research continue over a period of time? And sometimes, the questions are asked about dyads, for example, and the involvement of carers and their commitment to undertaking the research. Principle of justice, very much about the capacity and the ability to involve diverse groups of people in selection criteria. We often see, especially in at University of Queensland, we don't get too much in the way of diversity in terms of translations or non-English speaking background participants. And it's always a concern in terms of, are we looking at only specific subsets of the dementia population? So the committees are always looking at that question of, how can we involve as many people as possible in the research within the limits of what the research question is. Beneficence, we look at safety and well-being of both the carers and the participants, who are many of the time aren't able to consent for themselves. However, it is a misnomer to say that they can't consent for themselves, and that has to be negotiated with the committee as how consent is achieved, and that is the final principle of respect. So those principles are really important in terms of the research. However, every research project is different, and every method is not dissimilar, but also the idea of how you get consent and how you deal with participants over a long period of time seems to be one of the issues that we have more concern about. Short-term projects don't seem to be terribly difficult. And as part of the respect process, it's how we go about providing the information to participants and carers. We're always looking for simplicity, icons, tables. When there are many steps to a project, for example, or many interactions, a nice table setting out, week 1 to week 12, what the activities are and what's occurring, so that both the reviewers can understand it, but also the participants can understand. And finally, of course, it's how this information is fed back to participants, whatever the learnings of the research project are. It's how much information is provided back to participants and carers. We always do want to see that closure of the research loop, if you like, or the feedback cycle, so that that information is there is a gain and a beneficence to the community as to what are the outcomes of research. So within that, of course, then we're dealing with your data management and the issues of confidentiality and anonymity of participants, or if you're not wishing to, or if participants want to be known, and then what are you doing if you're taking videos, or if you're taking providing individual case examples, there's consent for that to take place. So to round it off, there's so many things in research application, but consistency in the application throughout the information sheets, the recruitment flyers and so forth, about how the research is being undertaken, where it's going to be done, and how it's going to be processed throughout the life cycle of the research is so important. Where we find the best tip is, again, to have a simple, clear plan of how the research is being undertaken and provide that information to ethics committees. I don't see too many committees who we have 2 committees at UQ, And and I think Nadika can speak on this at some point in time, but most of the research is well done, and it goes through quite clearly, quite easily through the committee. There isn't a huge concern for the vulnerability of the group, unless, of course, it's more in clinical trial research where the Guardianship Act is important, or the requirements of guardianship become, paramount to consent. But again, most of the health research we do is not related to clinical trial type research, but there is some of that. So just know again what the requirements are for consent and how it's going to be implemented. And I think everyone now talks about dynamic consent, how we continue to seek consent throughout the research project when we're looking at dealing with vulnerable people who may or may not be able to consent at different times through the project. I think I'll leave it there. That's about 10 minutes. So hopefully we can ask questions later.
Thank you very much, Chris. So I think definitely a key message from what Chris has been saying here is that the Human Research Ethics Committee is here to help. I think that's a really key point there, just to help all of us as researchers to adhere to these really core principles of beneficence and justice and so on. So thank you very much, Chris, for sharing those insights and top tips with us. I'm going to now hand over to Jackie. Jackie is going to introduce our next speaker. Thanks, Jackie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jackie Weston, and I have a teaching and research position in the occupational therapy team at University of Sydney, so welcome. I would like to introduce our next speaker, Associate Professor Margie McAndrew. Margie's been a registered nurse for over 30 years now. The majority of that time has been spent as a clinician with extensive experience working with older people and people living with dementia in both acute and residential aged care settings. Since completing her PhD in 2014, she's taken an academic position at Queensland University of Technology in the School of Nursing, and in 2023 added the role of Director of the Dementia Training Australia section, I guess, for Queensland and New South and Northern Territory. Margie has a program of research focusing on improving quality of care and safety for people living with dementia through improved assessment and use of non-pharmacological interventions, particularly in residential aged care. The majority of her research involves lived experience experts as co-researchers, advisors, and participants. Over her relatively short career as a researcher, she's been navigating ethics committees to ensure people living with dementia can engage with research as they desire and to their fullest capacity. And Margie's going to share some of these experiences with you today and highlight these ethical considerations around informed consent. Thanks, Margie.
Thank you, Jackie. And is it okay if I share slides? Yep. Okay, hopefully you can see that. Great. So I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, laws, customs and creation spirits, and recognise that these lands have always been places of teaching, research and learning. So the first step when you're thinking about consent is to actually read the National Statement on Ethics Conduct in Human Research. And in there you'll see that for when you're looking at consent, it must be voluntary. People must receive sufficient information about what they're doing, and they need to understand what it is they are expected to do. So barriers then to gaining consent: if there's a power indifference, you're not able to really say that that is voluntary, or it may impact on the voluntary nature of it. If English, say, is their second language, they may not be able to receive the information that you're giving them, or they may have sensory deficits. And if someone has a cognitive impairment, that's going to impact further in terms of being able to interpret that information and adequately understand it. And that could be a temporary issue, or it could be a permanent issue, as is the case for dementia. So in the research that I'm doing, most of my work is in residential aged care. It's with people living with dementia. And so gaining consent from them has always been a challenge. As Chris explained, it's often when you're trying to get things through an ethics committee, it's more around making sure you're articulating exactly what you're wanting to do, how you're going to do it, and why you want to do that, which I'll talk more about as we go on. So who are the vulnerable populations? The three groups of people that I particularly work with are those in highly dependent positions, those with a cognitive impairment, and also those of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander backgrounds. So I am constantly working with vulnerable populations. I'm by no means an expert, and I'm always surprised at what I think I've nailed how to do an ethics application, and an ethics committee will come up with a new question about it. So I'm constantly learning as well. The problem of not including people with dementia in research, and a lot of the research that you'll read will have an exclusion criteria being that people with the cognitive impairment are excluded. It's put in the too hard basket, and for many it is, it slows up. You go from having to do just a low risk application to a high risk application, which takes longer. And as a result, we're not fulfilling the desires of people living with dementia, and that is that nothing is done about us without us. We're not hearing their voices. And as a result, sometimes the research doesn't hit the target. We're not actually doing the research that people with dementia want us to be doing, or the way that the outcomes that they're finding still don't meet their needs. So this is really important that you do persevere, you do work with your ethics committees to get your research approved, because it is important. So what are the ethical considerations that you need to think about when working with a person with dementia? And the first thing you need to think about is your study design, and how can you minimise the risk for that person. You're arguing the risk-benefit balance, so you want the benefits to the person to outweigh the risk there. And that is all in your study design that you propose. What are you actually asking the person to do? And can you get that in a less invasive way or a less burdensome way? So thinking about that as well. And how you actually determine how the capacity of that person to, one, participate and contribute, but also to give consent. And a really important thing, as Chris also described, is getting consumer involvement, getting that early and getting their contribution to your study design. For a long time, we used clinical cut-offs for whether someone had capacity to give consent, but there is limitations to that, because some people with severe dementia have demonstrated ability to understand what it is that research is asking them to do. And so we do use what is called the evaluation of signed consent measure. This is a validated measure. It goes through 5 questions, and it evaluates whether that person understands what they're being asked to do, understands the risks, the benefits, what they need to do if they no longer want to participate, and what they do if they feel discomfort. So it's a step-by-step process that you can go to then decide, well, that person does have, on that day that you're testing, that person does have the ability to give consent. If they don't, you will probably need to look at a proxy consent giver to then assess whether that person should be involved. And all the way through your research, you need to be looking for the signs of assent and dissent. So those non-verbal signs that the person is happy to still be involved, or what you're asking them to do is now causing them discomfort and you should cease and desist. So that's a constant process that goes through every step of your research. I'm now going to go through just one example of a project that I conducted. And in this project, we wanted to speak to people living with dementia to explore what they thought about some recommendations about how to improve their safety. We wanted to speak to 10 people with a diagnosis of dementia, and they needed to be able to do this on Zoom. This was during COVID lockdown, so our only option was to collect data via Zoom, and they needed to have capacity to be able to participate in a discussion. So what were the risks that we were dealing with? So there could be fatigue. Any participation in research can cause fatigue to any participant, so that's no different. And there could, at the time when we were doing it, it was possible that participating via Zoom could also cause some anxiety, which we also needed to consider. But at this stage, if we were doing this with anyone else, this would be a low risk type of application that we were doing. Because it was a person living with dementia and may possibly experience the situation that we were discussing, it could have been that just through our discussions, they suddenly realised I'm at risk of getting lost. And that then causes more than just a bit of discomfort. That could then cause distress. And of course, it's a vulnerable population. They all had a diagnosis of dementia, so they had some level of cognitive impairment there. So that pushed us up into a high risk application. But what were the benefits? The benefits were that we were giving these people a voice, and there is much evidence around the fact that that is important to most participants in research, that they're given a voice. And hopefully the outcomes of our research will hit the target, which of course is another benefit. So our consent process was quite in-depth. To get our heads around it, we created this quite in-depth flowchart, which we did put into our application as well. And one of the complicating factors was that the participant information form went out to people via social media, or they may have got it through an email. And so they had already read the participant information form to then call the researcher, but it may have been the care partner that called us, or it may have been the person with dementia themselves. So we had two pathways coming in, and our aim was to speak with the person with dementia on the telephone to be able to do the completing the evaluation to sign informed consent. I didn't expect people to off the cuff be able to recall what they had read on the participant information form. I went through the participant information form. I told them what the research was about. I then asked them, can you tell me what the research is about? I then went through the risks and asked them to then tell me about the risks. So I broke it down into manageable chunks to discuss with them, and then asked them if they were understood that. On our second meeting, because we were quite early in the COVID time, Zoom wasn't all that well taken up. And so we had an opportunity for people to practice on Zoom prior to the actual interview. And at that time, we recorded their consent. And we then set up a third meeting to be able to do the actual interview with them. Of the 11 people who went through this process, there was only one person who wasn't able to make it through the evaluation phase. We met with them a second time to see if it was just a once-off. Perhaps they were having a bad day, perhaps it was a bad time of day. And at the second one, they were still unable to describe what their participation would be. And the person themselves made the decision that this wasn't for them. So they didn't participate. But we did have 10 people who were able to participate in our interviews, which was great. And the whole way along, we looked out for those signs of assent and dissent. And some people had family carers with them who were able to point that out to us if we missed that. One of the questions from the committee was, how can you guarantee that the opinion of the person with dementia is valid. And our response to that, of course, was that it was their opinion because they were talking about it. It was therefore valid. So that was an interesting question that I'd never been asked before. So just sharing that with you. This is a useful reference. It's about advocating for people with dementia, their right to participate in research. I now reference this in all of my applications, and our ethics committee here at QUT have commented how useful this paper has been. So if you get a chance, have a read of that. Some of the things we did for risk mitigation, we had people could have a support person there who then were able to alert us of fatigue and agitation. We offered that practice session for Zoom, and we had a second person in our interviews just to help with IT support if it was needed. We picked a time that suited that person for when they were most alert and they didn't have cognitive fatigue. And we're very flexible with that. We gave the participants the questions before they even came to the interview. And there was the option to, if they became fatigued, we could set up another meeting to complete the interview. So they were the main things that we did for risk mitigation. So in terms of navigating an ethics committee, provide as much detail as possible and think about a contingency plan for contingency plans and make sure you articulate those. Consult with the ethics committee chairperson. If you're not quite sure how to go about it, they're just such a great source of information, and I've always found them really helpful for that. Make sure you read the national statement so that you know what you're aiming for. And it's really important that we do advocate for the right of people with dementia to have agency, and don't assume just because they have a stage of dementia that they don't have capacity. Evaluate that and try and support a person to be involved. So thank you. I think that's all of me. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Margie. That was really, really helpful. Lots of things to unpack in the question and answer section. So I won't go on about that right now. What I'll do is hand you over to Muna, who will introduce our next speaker. So thanks very much, Margie.
All right, thank you so much for that, Margaret. And I'll be using that reference from now on when I do my ethics application, FYI. So thank you so much. So for the next session, we have a pair of speakers. We've got Dr. Marianne Coleman, who had already introduced herself at the start of the webinar. But for anyone who's joined just now, she's a clinical eye care researcher based between the University of Melbourne and the National Vision Research Institute at the Australian College of Optometry. And Marianne's research has focused on helping people living with dementia to have a good experience when they go for an eye test. And we also have Natalie, and Natalie is a dementia advocate, and she's going to do her own introduction. Take it away, Natalie.
All right, so I'm up first. I'm going to just quickly share my screen. Just got a couple of slides to share. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my lovely green slides. So this is kind of a case study. This was an interview study, and we applied for ethics approval with the option to be able to include people living with dementia who may not have capacity. I'll be around for the whole Q&A, so this is going to be really quick. Happy to answer more questions about the project itself during that. This is just focused on the ethics approval process for the project. So we involved 4 dementia advocates in this project, 2 people living with dementia and 2 people with past or current experience of being a carer. So I don't really have time to cover all the different ways that we involve dementia advocates here, but there's just a few examples of the things that we did together. Probably the big one was reviewing all of the documents that people living with dementia and carers would read themselves when deciding about taking part in the research. So the plain language statement and the advertising materials. And we also chatted about strategies to help people living with dementia to take part in the interview, as kind of listed here. And we also piloted created the topic guide with Natalie, who's presenting after me, to try it out, check the clarity of the questions and the pacing before submitting that to the ethics committee for approval. Also, we talked about some of the difficulties with getting ethics approval for research projects involving people living with dementia. And on the suggestion of one of our dementia advocates, we included a short Dementia Australia video about adapting communication for people living with dementia so that they could have a better understanding of why we had done what we'd done with the documents that we submitted. So in terms of guidance documents available to you to help you with formatting your plain language statements and so on, there's the Dementia Australia language guide, and there's also the UK Dementia Voices guidance on formatting written information, which I'll go over, what this kind of looks like in a sec. So this is the participant information sheet that we had for our research project. And this is the front page. The photos on the front page were a suggestion from Dementia Advocates guiding our project to be clear about who these people are that people living with dementia and carers might be interacting with and what they are doing on the project. So what kind of context might you be interacting with them about? So note the increased text spacing, larger font, use of a non-serif font, so no little tags on the letters or anything. Just makes it a little easier reading. This is the second page. This is a one-page summary of the research with the 3 key components that are needed to be able to give informed consent, as touched on by Margaret in the last talk. So what are we doing? Why do we want to do it? What's involved for the people that are taking part, and those risks and benefits of taking part. Again, note the clear headings, the white space, or rather yellow space. We use this yellow color to indicate important info, and the use of bullet points to convey clear and concise information. So how did the ethics committee respond to this? These are some of their feedback. They felt the plain language summary was too long and they wanted just like a one-pager for people with dementia and more information on requests. So it's the main thing that I wanted to kind of pick up on here. So we went back to the ethics, to the dementia advocates supporting our project in order to prepare our response to the ethics committee comments. So we chatted with them about this idea that the ethics committee had put forward about, here's some basic info and you've got to ask for more info. So we did that for that particular context there. So that's just a couple of examples of the ways that we involved dementia advocates to prepare our response to the ethics committee, and we got the approval. So that's basically where we're at. So these slides are available to review on the recording anyway. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I'm sure you're all very excited to hear from Natalie. I'm just going to pass over to you, Natalie.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Coleman. I'm Natalie. My academic achievements include a Master's in Special Education and a dual award degree in Political Science. I have extensive experience in both mainstream and special education settings, spanning over 15+ years. I sit on the Dementia Australia Advisory Committee, and I'm a Board of Director for the Australian Aphasia Association. These roles allow me to advocate for all people living with dementia. I was first diagnosed with primary progressive aphasia in 2021. A language-led dementia where word finding and communication are the earliest and most prominent signs. That being said, I'm delighted to be part of this webinar to share with you why being involved in a research project at its earliest stages is important as a Dementia Australia advocate, and also share some tips with you. Firstly, I would like to say that it is crucial to always remember that the advocate is more than diagnosis. It's important to provide emotional support, convey a sense of we're in this together, and that other unique and valued aspects of their personhood remain and should be respected. It has been a privilege working with Dr. Coleman on this amazing eye care research project. From my very first meeting, I was welcomed for who I am as a person and for who I am professionally, which is an educator, followed by my lived experience of PPA. I was able to provide feedback on ethics approval and design. This gave me a sense of great empowerment and purpose, and most importantly, that what I have to say is valued, respected, and that my voice is being included. I cannot stress enough how important it is to encourage multimodal communication when working with people living with dementia. These tips might be helpful. Always allow more time and clarify that the discussion has been understood. Build in options, yes or no questions, or visual cues so the advocate can indicate a response. Check the advocate has hearing aid or glasses if relevant. Always alert the advocate to change in topic. Can advocate use facial expressions or tone of voice to tell you? So essentially, what's important to remember, by using as many modes of communication as possible will provide a pathway into a supportive conversation. Lastly, these are my 3 standout examples working alongside Dr. Coleman. Communication. Dr. Coleman shared the research findings with me at the end of the study and gave me occasional updates by email, so I knew how things were going and what the key findings were. I also reflected on those key findings and shared those reflections with Dr. Coleman. Flexibility. In the beginning, Dr. Coleman asked me what my communication preferences were and how I preferred to give feedback. We met up in person so I could look at the documents and give my feedback. We took regular breaks and chatted about other things or sat quietly so I could recover some energy. Respect. Dr. Coleman always respects my time and always would tell me exactly which part of a document to review and the maximum amount of time I would expect to spend on it. Now, I will leave you with this thought. Many have told me, you don't look like you have dementia. But what does dementia look like? Unfortunately, this common phrase unintentionally perpetuates stigma and stereotypes. The words we use affect how people with dementia are perceived and treated, and impacts the support and empowerment they feel within society. Instead, let's here today promote understanding and inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marianne and Natalie, for the valuable information on how to include people with lived experience in consent and dementia research. My name's Dr. Diana Matovic, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Macquarie University. I would like to introduce our final speaker for today, Professor Yunhee Juan, who is a professor of healthy aging and director of Step Up for Dementia Research and Step Up for Aging Research at the University of Sydney. Her research focuses on dementia models of care, rehabilitation and re-enablement approaches to care, and aged care workforce and citizen science and public involvement in research. Thank you, Yunhee.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the invitation, and my apology for not being able to stay. Can you hear me now? I realized I was on mute.
Yeah, we got it. Take it away, Yunhee.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about Step Up. My focus is very much around how Step Up actually provides support to the public and researchers to help each other in terms of research participation. But how we actually manage to navigate ethics so that you can be, as researchers, confident the way that you use our program is ethically sound. So as many of you know that we, Step Up was, built 2019, and it's designed to support the public and researchers, for efficient recruitment process. But at the end of the day, it's also about empowering the public, that they have a voice, they have a choice, rather than passively waiting for someone to tap on their shoulder. So we provided this support to anybody 18 years and older in terms of a public, and researchers who are doing dementia and aging related research. So our program started with the dementia research only, funded by the federal government. And then 2022, we introduced the Step Up for Aging research. We are hoping, and in the near future, that we will have another arm of a Step Up for research to be introduced. Now, people can sign up by online, telephone, or by post, and they could actually complete the form. When we first introduced, we really worked with those people who are likely to be interested in dementia research. So the whole model was, based on the UK's joint dementia research, but we had to make sure that this is suitable for the Australian public. So we had a lot of public consultations with people with dementia and their families and other people interested in dementia. So it took us about 6 months to prepare, and this is the type of policies and protocols that we had to prepare. We have a privacy collection statement, access control protocol, so that who has access to what level of data, and also we had a complaints procedure and proxy consent. So basically, what we have done is that if someone is deemed, lack capacity to sign up themselves, of course, we have no way of understanding who is has capacity to participate or register themselves. But if they feel that they need support, their family member or person responsible or enduring guardian could actually sign on behalf of that person. So we have a process for proxy consent. We also have a process, a two-step consent process. So when people come to our website, they actually ask the first set of questions to make sure that they understand what it is. And then after they have read the consent statement, then they go on to start registering. So this was a requirement by our ethics, and to make sure that people don't just sign up without full understanding of what it is. So as you may know, that there are lots of other ways of recruiting participants, similar to Step Up, but those registers may not have the kind of steps that we have taken. So basically, people who have registered on our Step Up, they are more likely to say yes to the study invitation. We don't have the data yet, but we are hoping to get that data one day, because what we know is that a lot of researchers talk about within a very short time that they were able to recruit participants. So what I know is that as those volunteers in our database, because they have gone through multiple steps of being explained what it is and how they're going to have their data used through the program, they tend to trust. And that was actually shown in the survey we did a couple of times at the beginning of our Step Up program. What I also want to emphasize is that we make sure that when researchers use our data, that they actually undergo a process of 1-hour training. And they also we have a process of CI's Chief Investigator's Acknowledgement, and also data access agreement at an institutional level. So those processes are designed to, make sure that, relevant people are accountable for their actions. So we want to make sure, as a chief investigator, if I have my research team member accessing Step Up, I make sure that my staff member is conducting or using the data in an ethical manner. So they have to go through the training, but also that I have to make sure that I provide sufficient supervision, because I am the person responsible for the overall study. So we also have institutional agreement that really sets out, and a lot, because our Step Up data contains personal and medical information, it is considered highly sensitive data. So we have to make sure that at an institutional level, we currently have 28 institutions across Australia that have given data access agreement. So that means that, if their staff members, their researchers are not conducting, or using our Step Up service in an ethical manner, and aligned with the research integrity policy, then their organization has responsibility to manage that. So it is really important that, we have those steps created to ensure that, we are using, allowing the researchers to use public data in an ethical way, and also a secure way. So this is what we have, and we, sometimes we have a one-on-one conversation with the researchers about how they use, participants' data. So, Step Up is, we're still offering this for free. Anyone can use this for free. But what we are really sensitive about is that volunteers' privacy. And those of you who have used Step Up, you know that when you go to your dashboard, you get to see those people's, their personal information. You don't actually have their name, but you actually get to see their email address. So in the next phase of our Step Up, we are going to make sure that email is not visible. But at the moment, there is a reasonable level of, personal information you can access. What we have to make sure is that researchers are not exposing this data outside the computer environment. So we emphasize that you don't just copy that information and then keep elsewhere that can be, accessed by other people, because it's really important that, whether it's your family member or people who are not involved in the study, they don't either accidentally or intentionally access the information you have extracted from the Step Up. So you are not allowed to take a screenshot. You're not allowed to, keep a whole list of records in one place that can be actually accessed by other people. So those are the things that we do in our Step Up. And thanks to everyone's support, we now have over 2,000 volunteers fully registered in our Step Up. And we are really hoping that we get more participants in the near future. But, I'm very proud to be able to say we have, there have been over 150 studies used our Step Up. And a lot of, researchers, were able to complete the study. And I know some of you guys have used our Step Up, but it's really, pleasing to see that the program is helping you and other people. So the only way we can continue our program is researchers using this in a very ethical way. And I'm hoping that we continue the service as long as possible. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Yunhee, for that very informative talk about the Step Up database. And I personally have found it very helpful for recruitment. So I recruited 66% of my sample thanks to Step Up, and very grateful for the resource. All right, so I think I'll hand over now to Mona, who will open up the floor for questions and answers.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Diana. And thank you also to the panel and to Yunhee for sharing their insightful experiences about obtaining and navigating consent, and also for Yunhee for telling us about Step Up, because I am also another dementia researcher who's used Step Up on several occasions and found it really, really useful in facilitating recruitment. Thank you, Yunhee. So as Diana mentioned, we're now going to open up for questions. Please feel free to insert your questions in the Q&A as we open up for the panel for this session for discussion. And I will take it away. I'll start with the first question, if that's okay, Jackie. And I think this is directed at Margaret, but feel free, Chris, or anyone else if they want to chime in. Has the evaluation to sign informed consent measure been published, and how can people reference it?
I believe it has. And yes, there is a reference, but I will try and locate it and send it through to Jackie so she can then send it through to others. So yes, it has been published as far as I know.
Yes, I'll try and find it while we're waiting for more questions to come through. But I've certainly used it, Margie, and it's been a really helpful tool to use. But I would like to follow up with a question on that. One of the points that you raised was that there is a question around identifying risk. Now, what happens if the person living with dementia is not able to identify a risk because the nature of the study is actually almost negligible? For example, it could be a pleasant experience in almost every respect of being asked for someone's opinion in their own care home setting, for example, and it involves someone just talking about pleasant things. So there's not a lot of risk that can be identified. So how would you manage that situation?
So it'd be very unlikely to have any research that wouldn't have fatigue as a risk factor, and so you would just discuss the fact that just by talking to me, you may feel more tired, and I'm happy to stop the conversation anytime, and we can take it up at another time. So it would be really unlikely, even if the research was around eating yummy fairy floss. You know, the risk could be that you'll get a tummy ache. You know, even pleasant things have a risk associated with it. So I would never expect the person with dementia to come up with the risks themselves. So you would explain what those risks are, and then ask them to describe those risks to you.
And sorry, is there just another thing? Is there a minimum on the consent measure that you have? Is there a minimum number of risks? Is it 2, or is it a risk, or is it 3? You know, like, is there any sort of structure? I think.
So it's based on your participant information form. So whatever you've put in your participant information form is what you're evaluating. Do they understand that information from the participant information form? And so it may be there's only 1 risk, or there could be 5 risks and you would need to go through all of those.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I have another question. While people are thinking about these things a little bit more, and so I do encourage everyone to think about their own examples as well. But I would like Chris, if he could, and potentially Margie to comment as well. But first, Chris, you mentioned the term dynamic consent. And is that something that you've seen documented in ethics applications? And just talk a little bit more about that, please.
Sure, I'll provide some references for everyone. It's becoming more common with long-term studies where you can't do a one-off consent at the commencement of the study period because people will change. It could be any of those vulnerable groups, for example, where their medical condition changes. And it also just a check-in, if you like, if you're still happy. It's part of that ongoing question about the right to withdraw as well. So we can ask people whether they are still happy to participate in the research and have their data, because people change with their medical experience. And I don't know, especially when it comes to carers and the involvement of of having a participant-carer relationship, and the relationship changes, and the capacity of the carer to participate in the research. If it's arduous type of lots of activities going on, they might be time poor, for example. So there's it's one of those issues for not all, but for some, where it's an ongoing study over a period of time.
And how does that, I guess we can draw our own links, I guess, in terms of it relates also to that difference that Margaret was talking about between assent and dissent. Sure. and how assent and dissent and dynamic consent are the same or different. Or
yeah, I don't think with the dynamic consent more so, but it's really a consent process in terms of participating in the event that's occurring. Whereas we've talked about fatigue, and then you might stop and organise to come back and do part of the research. Whereas the dynamic consent would be more about not only come back to do part of the research, but continue to do part of the research, further research.
Yeah, there's a lot of nuances.
Absolutely, and the researcher best knows the participants because they've been working with them, and they should know whether they're behaving differently to what they had been in the past, or the relationship with the carer has changed. I mean, it may be that the sometimes the carer does not want to be there.
Thanks.
Related to that is a question that I've received a couple of times from ethics committees around fluctuating capacity and fluctuating impairment, and my response to that is that constant evaluation of assent and dissent, but also a person who says no today may say yes 10 minutes down the track. So I will always give them a second opportunity and put that in my ethics, that I'll go back and ask a second time at a different time. And if it is no again after a second time, then I respond to that. So in that mode, you've got your consent, they've provided that to you, but at that moment, no, they don't want to do it. But 10 minutes later, they do. So it is that short-term fluctuations you get as well.
Sure. Would ethics committees not think that would be undue pressure to ask a second time?
There used to be, and Dementia Australia have taken them down, unfortunately. There used to be guidelines in Dementia Australia that recommended that if approaching a person with dementia to provide care or those sorts of things, if at first they don't consent, then you can return in 10 minutes time and ask again. Those guidelines have now been taken down, unfortunately, but it is a care practice, it is part of usual care that this would occur, which is what I base that action on.
Right, thank you. We do have another question which relates to Step Up for Dementia, and I guess maybe Muna, you might be able to answer that question.
Sure.
Being an international student working on interventions for dementia at Griffith, is Step Up open for researchers outside of Sydney Uni?
Most certainly. So Step Up does have agreements with universities. There's, I think, at least over 15, where it enables their researchers and academics to use Step Up. My best advice to the person who asked the question is to email the administrator, Step Up for Dementia, and ask them if there's a current agreement with their university. And if not, then they can provide advice on how to arrange one. but it's usually more straightforward and accessible to researchers nationwide. So good luck with that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. Marianne, would you like to add something to that, or you're okay?
I'm from University of Melbourne and I use Step Up in my project. So yeah, absolutely. You don't need to be part of University of Sydney to be able to access it. You just need to obviously fill in the relevant bits and pieces and complete the training. Having that opportunity to complete the training is super duper important because it helps you to be familiar with the Step Up system and some other kind of considerations for contacting participants. And yeah, it's just very, very helpful. So it's definitely well worth completing the training component for it. And yeah, that is actually a requirement for being able to actually use the platform.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Now I've got another question for Margaret and for Chris. How do we get people living with dementia or with living experience to be involved in grant applications, and then how does that relate to ethics, for example? Because often part of the grant requirements are that, you know, you've involved lived experience or people with that living experience beforehand in your study design, like we've talked about that. I think both Margie and Chris mentioned that. But how do we do it? And then the follow-up question is about how should we pay for that, and should we pay for that?
Margaret, do you want to go?
Yeah, so I've done a couple of ways, and I'm going to, once I've finished talking, I'll put a link to a resource that is directly about consumer involvement for researchers. So it's a manual that was developed through the DCRC to help researchers to do this. So I work with Mr. Doug Taylor. He's a co-investigator on our Getting Home Safely with Dementia project. He represents his wife Eileen as an investigator on that, but also all people living with dementia. So that's he is a co-investigator. We write the grant together. When preparing the grant, we have a discussion first. So what are we trying to achieve? What method should we use? He's always very useful for making, if I'm involving people living with dementia, that the design is appropriate for people living with dementia. And he keeps me on track with aims of research. Rather than straying off to things that I might be interested in, he keeps me focused on what is important to people living with dementia. Another way is to form a reference group, and you invite people living with dementia to be on that reference group. If you're having group sort of meetings and things, it's always good to have a couple of people living with dementia, so there is that safety in numbers, they feel more secure, and inviting their care partners, if that's appropriate, to be with them is always a good option. And yes, you do pay them for their time. It may not necessarily be every meeting that I pay Doug for, but I try and build into it that he participates in, for example, I'm doing some co-design workshops, so he will participate in those and will get paid for that. If you don't have a bank of money to draw on, it can be hard to pay for that early consumer involvement. But I know, like at QUT, we now have some funds set aside so that researchers can pay for that early consultation with consumers.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, look, I would concur there also. It really would be well before the grant stage, you'd have a panel or a consumer panel you've set up and referenced, or because it's not a one-off project, there'll be other projects which you'd probably want to develop as well. The other issue too is Queensland Health have a very good consumer engagement strategy, and they have recommended payments, half a day, full day, whatever the payment structure are. So there is a guideline as to what's happening within the Queensland Health portfolio, and I think it probably be the minimum requirements for anybody else trying to match that.
Yeah, I'm aware that the New South Wales Consumers has a guideline as well, with hourly rates and so on that you can look up as a resource. Marianne.
Thanks, Jackie. Yeah, just a couple of things I can sort of throw in on this topic. If you're working with Dementia Australia's Dementia Advocates Network, they have their own rate of remuneration, which has been set by their own tribunal. Now, when having discussions about this topic, not every dementia advocate necessarily wants to receive remuneration. They all have their own reasons for being involved. The really important thing is to offer it and give them the opportunity to either accept or decline. In terms of the funding for it, it can be if you have a research project that has been funded, for example, by, say, Dementia Australia Research Foundation, or for some of these funders, the release of funds can actually be tied to you securing your ethics approval. So you have to actually send your letter from the Research Ethics Committee to the funder to actually release your funding. So if you have costed for involvement of people with lived experience in your project, including in this ethics approval procedure, you can end up with a bit of a circular situation, in that you can't get the money to pay them until you have the ethics approval. So how are you supposed to involve them in the ethics approval process and those review and documentation if you don't have that money to be able to remunerate them, right? And so the answer is you can ask. And so for my Dementia Friendly Eye Care project, I actually made a special arrangement with Dementia Australia Research Foundation to be able to release some of those funds beforehand, so that I could remunerate the advocates that were involved in the ethics approval process. So if you don't ask, you don't get, basically. And so don't let that be a barrier to you involving people with lived experience in these earlier stages of that research process. As Chris mentioned, there is that opportunity to actually involve people with lived experience even when you're writing the grant. So I consulted with a few dementia advocates during that grant writing process to check in with them about the relevance of the study to them. Did they feel the topic was important? What were the sort of upfront costs of people being involved in the study as dementia advocates and actually guiding the research project, so that I could ensure that I had thought about these costs and appropriately costed for them as part of the funding application. So you can sort of involve people with lived experience to talk about their involvement. If I mean, it's kind of a bit Inception in a way, but it's just to highlight that these are different things that you can do. And I didn't really have enough time to talk through all of the different ways that dementia advocates have been involved in this project. I just limited the focus to how they were involved specifically in the ethics application. But Chris touched on the importance of closing the research loop, so about that dissemination of research findings back to the people who took part. And this is something that you are expected to put into your ethics application, that you are expected to document how you plan to tell people about the findings of your research. And so I was able to actually speak with the dementia advocates guiding my project about that side of things as well, and to actually develop the key messages of the research with them, and subsequently the plain language summary that was distributed to everybody who took part in the project. I'm going to hand back to Mona, because Mona had her hand up there.
Yeah, only just because Chris highlighted the Health Consumers Queensland guidance on consumer remuneration, and I was wondering if that's something what the ethics panel looks to when people reference when they provide like some price on how they're going to reimburse their consumers.
Let me state first up that we actually also remunerate our panel members. So it's an expectation that people are giving their time and generosity, but in no way are we paying them for a service. We're actually trying to make it an experience so they actually get some thanks for the time they commit. So I don't think the committee has an issue because they are themselves are getting paid accordingly to pretty well a principle of, you know, what's your time worth. And I think society's moved on where everything is free because we are busy people, but also we need to respect the knowledge. And I know when it comes with Indigenous advocates, you know, we're not respecting the knowledge of people they bring to the table. It may be okay for academics who are on the panel and committee because they're getting paid by the university, whereas people who have knowledge in a field, be they a lawyer, for example, can you imagine the normal payments being forgotten, if you like, by attending a meeting, what they're not doing. So we have to acknowledge that there are some hardships involved, and especially for the lay people who are often retirees on very, very low incomes. Making a journey out to St. Lucia is quite an ordeal itself, let alone finding parking. So yes, we do want to keep them on board and acknowledge what they are contributing to the organisation who can afford to pay them.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm going to circle back a little bit to the reiterative process of getting consent. And Chris, you mentioned longer term studies, but I was wondering whether that's something that we should be looking at in shorter studies. So if you could comment on that time frame, for example, if it's a cross-sectional one-off assessment, and how that reassenting or, you know, re-engaging with the research should fit on the timelines of the research.
Yeah, look, the reconsent really should be over a period of time. If you're doing your research within a short period of time, we'll say, and this is what, you know, people like Mark and Marianne who are in the field know what a good amount of time is. But if you're having a break, half a day break, or coming back, you know, dealing with people with dementia, you have to then go back to your basics and say, you know, are we still dealing with the same person we had this morning in many ways, or this afternoon? And the fatigue issues, and it's a bit like being in the hospital where you have people who have taken medication and they're not the same person post-medication as they were beforehand. And so you need to ask, would you say, well, a delirium or whatever, is this appropriate for me to continue this research, or should I re-establish another contact point? But that's only the theory of it. It's the practice that has more important.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Diana, I think you've got a question.
Thanks, Jackie. Around that, so with the capacity to consent and sort of advice about, for instance, I'm about to do a 3-month study, and so and I'm doing it with people with mild cognitive impairment and early dementia. So I'm trying to decide if, you know, it would be a good idea for me to confirm capacity to consent throughout that process, or not really. And so if you had any advice on how you might manage that.
Sorry, Dan, that was to anyone in particular, or?
Well, perhaps to you, or maybe to Margaret.
Yeah, I think Margaret probably better in this one because she deals with everyday issues like that.
Thanks.
And I haven't done a longitudinal study, but how many touch points are you having along that 3-month period?
It's a social participation intervention. So we do some baseline measurements, and there's 3 to 5 phone calls to check in on how they're going with it and if they need any help. And then there's a 12-week measurement at the end. So there's opportunities for people to pick up if there is deterioration, and to use some judgment there.
Yeah, and there would be, you know, it is good practice to remind the person at each touch point, this is what the project is about. Is this still a good time for you? Are you still, you know, happy to participate in that? So you are reiterating each time and reminding the participant at each touch point as to what the project is about. Whether you go to the extent of checking their understanding, I think you would have to be guided by how that went in your first contact. If it was a little bit, tenuous, but you would have to evaluate, make a decision for each person as to how you would go forward. But certainly, reminding what their participation is and taking any questions at that time before you progressed each time is good practice.
Thank you.
Thank you. Marianne.
Yeah, just to sort of follow up on that, in the UK, I did a 8-month study, and it is important to just do a reminder of what your project is, what is involved, remind them that they have that opportunity to withdraw, and just that sort of general check-in about whether there's been any changes in circumstances between those contacts is important. To give an example, I had a couple of people that took part in my project where I was doing home visits. So these were people living with dementia at home, and then a couple of them did get transferred into residential aged care during that time. So I would sort of dial back in after like a few months and say, oh, hey, it's time for the next visit. Where are things at with you? And they'd say, oh, well, actually, they've now moved into residential aged care. It's important to bear in mind that there's actually quite a few people who are living with dementia who are actually taking part in multiple studies simultaneously. So I think it is an important thing to just sort of bear in mind that you may not be the only project that they are part of, and therefore it is actually quite reasonable to have to remind them about it, because they might be doing this trial or that other piece of research where they're popping into a study centre to have some tests done. So yeah, it's important to be able to do that and to be flexible as well, to be able to actually, for example, say, oh, hey, I can actually go and set up at the residential aged care facility if they still want to take part. Again, that focus on inclusion, and having that flexibility to be able to do that as part of the research project is important. And so from an ethics application perspective, I think it is important to not be afraid of the amendment. So my original plan for that research study was to be based in one of the clinics on site, like just around the corner from the memory clinic, right? To actually have a room on site and have everyone come there. And then, as I was sort of going through my recruitment, I found that actually loads of people were like, please, can you just come to my house, and that was just easier for them, and my equipment was portable, so I could do that. But at the time that I did the original ethics application, I didn't have approval to go to people's houses, right? So I had to apply for an amendment to be able to actually do that. So yeah, don't be afraid of the amendment. Sometimes things will come up as the study progresses, and in order to maintain that inclusion, to maintain that opportunity for participation, you do sometimes have to kind of change things up a little bit. Okay, back to you, Mona.
I just wanted to highlight, because I know we talked about informed consent and involving, our, people with lived experience, whether they're part of a panel or part of our study right from the beginning. I just wanted to highlight to everyone the importance of just acknowledging your people with lived experience, whether you're at presentations or whether you're, publishing results. I think I just wanted to sort of highlight that here and just acknowledge their valuable contribution and time. Whether they're
sorry, you can also, Muna, get funding in your grant to get them to come to help co-present as well. So not only acknowledging, but getting them to be there on the spot to talk to the research as well.
Yeah, or you can co-present if they're up for it. But I think acknowledgement is really key. But I'll take it over to you, Jackie, because there's one more person who has a question.
Yeah, thanks, Mona. Michelle, I think you've got a question for our panel. Michelle, I think you can maybe you can't unmute yourself. Just a minute. I will unmute you. I can find you.
I'm good, thank you. I was just wanting to see if I was on mute. Yeah, I couldn't tell. Thank you so much.
Thank you. you're on mute again. Do you want to ask a question?
I don't need to ask a question. Thank you so much.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. Thank you. Now, I guess I have not got any more questions. I think one of it's probably more of a comment, is that whole pressure around ethics. And you might want to comment, Chris, the questions around ethics, and you feel like you've got to get it right first time, and you get your response back from the ethics committee and you go, oh, it didn't get through, and that's so disappointing, and it doesn't fit with my timelines. And you know, so I guess Marianne sort of addressed it a bit too, with don't be worried about modifications.
Look, I think what people forget, it's a conversation that's happening because you've got people from diverse backgrounds who may not be familiar with your studies, and therefore they're asking questions to help them understand, which probably means it hasn't been as well explained as you might have thought. You're the knowledge maker, and you know it, whereas trying to understand it from a research ethics point of view can be very difficult, especially if the language is not simplified. And in that process itself, by simplifying the language, you're making it easier for the participant as well. So there are benefits to be gained by that, but often it's because it's not, especially the procedures may not be understood, and questions will arise. For example, for someone with dementia, would 60 minutes be a long time? How are they going to cope? What are you going to do? So they're the questions about the lived experience, as well as the theoretical questions about, you know, what are these assessment pieces, and, you know, how can they be managed by someone in that position? So you might get technical questions, but you also might get a lived experience question about how do you make someone comfortable who's not, especially if they're outside their premises or if they're going somewhere external. You've got a whole lot of issues. I remember a great study where someone was just doing a walking activity, and people who hadn't consented to the study just joined in the walking activity. And they wanted to know, well, what's my obligation here? But hey, if that's what they want to do and participate, they're not in the study, but they felt that this was a group coming out for a walk and they wanted to join in. You know, that happens. So there's so many things that happen in the field that the ethics committee can't determine, but it's that conversation. So you just get back to the ethics committee again later on and say, well, we're finding a lot of people joining us. You know, what's my obligations, and they're asking those sort of questions as well. It's amazing. It can be quite infectious, some of this research, and people want to participate who haven't been initially involved. So yes, it is. It shouldn't be seen as a negative. It's like, I'm sure when you've submitted a paper for publication, reviewers will always ask questions. Some of them you might be quite angry about, but, you know, like, did you read my paper? But at other times, I think the people on ethics committees are trying to really be supportive, because that's, you know, why they're there. They're not there to knock back research. It's, you know, it's a misnomer.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great reminder for us all that it's about that conversation.
Thank you very much. So we're just in the last few minutes of the webinar, so it is time to wrap up if there are no more last minute burning questions from our audience. So I would like to take the opportunity to say a huge thank you to everyone who has presented, and also a thank you to our webinar team as well. So thank you everyone for being a part of this, and to all of our audience for coming along to listen, for asking questions as well. So just listening in to what everyone has been talking about, I think there's a really central theme to all of the presentations and the questions that we've had as well around enabling inclusion. And that was the main purpose of the webinar, was how can we, as far as possible, be able to involve people with dementia in our research, and to ensure that their really important voices are heard in the work that we do, while also having these ethical principles that Chris outlined to us at the beginning at the heart of everything that we do. So I do hope that it's been a wonderful experience for everybody taking part, and that you've be going away with lots of helpful resources, food for thought, maybe thinking about how you can apply some of these ideas and suggestions to your own work, whether you are in the middle of a study and thinking about how you can adapt your project and thinking about maybe an ethics amendment, or you're just on the verge of starting a new application, or maybe you're even just starting a grant application from scratch. But either way, we hope that there has been something here for everyone. And you can, again, as a reminder, check out the ADNet EMCR Accelerator Research Group at our website. So we will be putting up a recording of the webinar on there, and you guys can all listen back at leisure. If you do have any further questions for any of us, please do feel free to get in touch with the Accelerator Network directly. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon. Thank you again for coming, and take care, everybody.
Thanks, Marianne.